Hello everyone, my name's Tiegan and today I'm presenting my dissertation research which explores the extent to which LGBTQ plus voices shape counsellor training and whether that training adequately reflects the diversity of LGBTQ plus experiences. This topic is something that I genuinely feel passionate about, and I want to start by saying something that really grounded this whole study for me, and it's that clients should never have to educate their counsellors on who they are. That simple idea is what led me to be here. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself and then we'll get straight into that research. I'm a trainee counsellor here at Bangor University, and this study here is my final year of my dissertation, and I also like to believe that I am an ally to the LGBTQ plus community. However, I want to be transparent about my position in this research. As an ally, I cannot speak from lived experiences alone from being in the LGBTQ plus community. That is precisely why I designed the study the way that I did, and that was so that I could centre the voices of those who were most directly affected by the quality of our current counselling training. I was careful to keep an open mind throughout the research and to allow the data to speak for itself rather than just assuming any particular outcome. So why have I chosen this topic, you may ask? Because LGBTQ plus individuals already face this disproportionate mental health challenges. This is in higher rates of anxiety, we see higher rates of depression, homelessness and suicidal ideation. So when they seek counselling, they should be able to be met with this genuine and understanding of what they're going through. However, research consistently shows that counsellors feel least confident in their practical skills when working with those in the LGBTQ plus community. And that gap really troubled me. I wanted to understand it better from the perspective of the community itself rather than the counsellors who have worked with the community. So let's look at the existing research and what it actually tells us. What motivated this study were the three interconnected problems that stood out for me. First, there was a significant skills gap. Studies would consistently show that counsellors report the lowest levels of competence in their practice skills when working with those in the LGBTQ plus community. And this is particularly striking because those same counsellors in these studies often also reported high awareness and positive attitudes. So, in other words, knowing that the right things in theory does not always translate into their practice skills and into their confidence. The second problem was that training is fragmented. LGBTQ plus content is frequently treated as an add-on. It is slotted briefly into existing diversity modules rather than being taught through structured lessons and critically informed coursework. Professional bodies like the BACP reference diversity in broad terms, but there are no explicit requirements for the LGBTQ plus specific skills to be developed. This results in a huge variation across programs. Programs may talk about LGBTQ plus experiences less, and some may really hone in on that. There is no equal amount of training that is dedicated to the LGBTQ plus community. And the third and most urgently is that LGBTQ plus individuals face genuine health disparities, including limited access to culturally competent care and experience of discrimination within healthcare settings. For example, transgender people often encounter barriers for gender affirming care. LGBTQ youth are disproportionately affected by bullying and homelessness. There are no abstract statistics. They are lived realities of the potential therapy clients. Taking these three issues together point a systemic problem. The counselling profession emphasises empathy and inclusion as values, but training programs has historically marginalised LGBTQ plus topics, and the gap has now led to some consequences. That being said, the current literature and research led me to the question that guided this study, which was to what extent do LGBTQ plus voices shape counsellor training curricula, and does current training adequately reflect the diversity of LGBTQ plus experiences? To address this question, the study then was guided by 3 specific objectives. Objective 1 was to explore LGBTQ plus clients and the potential clients' perspectives on counsellor competency. Crucially, the effectiveness of any training ultimately depends on whether it translates into meaningful support within the therapeutic relationship. So it will make sense to start by asking those on the receiving end. Objective 2 was to explore the LGBT perspectives on current training recommendations. Professional guidelines exist, but do they resonate with the communities that they are meant to serve? Objective 3 was to find out what extent LGBTQ plus community would actually like to see within the training, and this is moving beyond the evaluation to genuinely invite community voices into the process of the current curriculum design. All 3 objectives share a common thread, prioritising the perspectives of those most directly affected by the current counsellor training. So now we're going to briefly talk about the methodology and what was behind exploring the question and objective that we had developed. So we had used an online questionnaire and we distributed this across LGBT organisations, social media networks and the university channels such as SONA. An online survey was chosen deliberately as it offers accessibility and anonymity within the community, and it was especially important for participants to be able to discuss their sensitive and personal experiences without knowing who they truly were. In terms of sample size, we did want roughly around about 100 participants. However, only 67 participants had responded, and after excluding 6, as they unfortunately did not meet our inclusion criterion of identifying as someone within the LGBTQ plus community, we had a final sample size of 61 participants. All of these were adults and based within the UK, and the sample was predominantly female, with 77% of them being female. This then left us with 15% of them participants were male, and 8% were non-binary and self-identifying. Just under half identified as bisexual and 18% as gay or lesbian. Participants were recruited through purposive sampling and snowball sampling, as this was able to help reach further into the LGBTQ community. The questionnaire itself had 3 sections, so we used the first section to be able to explore experiences of counselling and perceptions of counsellor competency. The second then asked participants to rate the importance of different training topics, and then we moved slowly into our third section where we offered this use of open-ended questions to invite the participants to share what they felt should be included in our current training. As you can see, this was a mixed method design which allowed us to capture both the breadth of views across the sample and the depth and the nuance of individual experiences, allowing each person to respond how they wanted to. Ethically, this study received approval from Brandeis University Research Ethics Committee and was conducted in line with the BPS, BACP and NCPS guidelines. We were able to gain informed consent from each participant, and anonymity was maintained throughout, and participants were provided with signposting and support services should they have needed this at any point of our research. So we're moving on to the quantitative findings of our research, and participants here were asked to rate important things of 8 training topics. And you can see that the means rating on the chart, the pattern is really clear, as the highest rated topic was poverty, with a mean of 6.64. This was followed then by age at 5.23 and specific mental illness at 4.69. What is so interesting within all of this is that the LGBTQ plus competency scored notably lower at a 3.75. That gap is one of the more significant findings from this data, and it's worth highlighting That being said, then I ran a 3-dimensional test just to check whether that these differences were statistically significant. And they were, with a chi-squared value of 6.40 and a p-value of less than 0.001, it can be confident that the participants were genuinely prioritising some of these topics over others, rather than this just being down to a chance. And then finally, I tested whether ratings differed depending on who the participants identified as, whether that be their sex and their sexuality. The Counsellor test showed no significant differences, so the priorities were consistent across the whole community, regardless of individual identity. Following on from the quantitative results, I will now briefly walk through the qualitative analysis of the open-ended responses, which helped produce 5 overarching themes. So let's take a look at these briefly. So theme 1 was the foundational knowledge. Here is where we've seen participants were clear that counsellors needed a solid grounding in LGBTQ plus identities, terminology and lived experiences, with particular emphasis on trans, non-binary and asexual identities. Several describe this as a basic requirement for competence practice, not an optional extra. There were also a desire for counsellors to be remaining open to the evolving language that comes with this community. Theme 2 looked more into the intersectionality and diversity within the community. Participants emphasised that the LGBTQ plus is not a single homogeneous group. Experiences are shaped by their race, disability, religion, neurodiversity, age and their class. Training that treats all LGBTQ plus trients as having the same experiences will inevitably leave these counsellors feeling quite short. Theme 3, we move on to trauma, stigma and minority stress. This is where participants were frequently describing the need for counsellors to understand the psychological impacts of discrimination, the family rejection, religious trauma and bullying, and the stress of coming out. Trauma-informed practice was seen as central, but it wasn't seen as something that was peripheral. We move on to the 4th theme, where relational competence and therapeutic safety was quite particularly powerful in this aspect, that participants weren't just asking for competent counsellors, they were genuinely asking for some safety, the ability to create a non-judgmental, affirming space and to use respectful language to be able to communicate this authentic acceptance, leaving several of the participants distinguish between counsellors who knew the right terminology and those who genuinely conveyed an affirming presence, and the distinction mattered to them. And our final theme that came up was counsellors' self-awareness and their bias work. The participants emphasised the importance of counsellors examining their own beliefs, unconscious bias and emotional responses, and being able to manage this counter-transference and committing to ongoing reflective practice was seen as essential for ensuring that the therapy remains affirming and non-harmful to the LGBTQ plus community. So what can we make of these findings and results? Starting with the surprising salience of poverty, rather than viewing poverty as an economic hardship, as something separate from the LGBTQ plus identity, participants seem to understand poverty as part of the wider experience of minority stress, something that accumulates alongside stigma, discrimination, and social exclusion, suggesting that counsellor training needs to incorporate structural and political economic analysis and not just identity-based content. The relatively low proportionate of the LGBTQ plus competency is also theoretically interesting. I don't think it signals that LGBTQ plus competency is less important, rather that it may reflect this shift in how participants conceptualise it. if LGBTQ plus affirmative practice is understood as a foundational ethical baseline, something that every counsellor should simply have, then it might not feel like something that needs to be rated highly related to the other specialist areas. But this creates a risk. When competencies are assumed rather than explicitly taught, they can be something symbolically endorsed by insufficiently developed in practice. The absence of differences by sex and sexuality is something that we can look into that is meaningful. Despite the diversity amongst the LGBTQ plus community, participants appeared to share this broadly consistent view about what training should include, and particularly around structural inequality, mental health literacy, and affirming practice. And on the relational findings, I think it's where the research has some of its most clinically significant implications. Participants weren't just asking for the knowledge, they were asking for counsellors who can communicate genuine safety before a word of intervention is even spoken of. The therapeutic relationship, in this sense, may primarily be a mechanism of change, not just the vehicle through which a technique is delivered. As with all research, there are limitations, and this I feel is important to acknowledge. First, self-selection bias. Participants chose to partake in this, so this means that they may have held stronger views than those who did not, and the findings should be interpreted as reflecting the participants of motivated and engaged subset of the LGBTQ plus community rather than their broader population. Another limitation is on the only a subset of participants completed this open-ended questions. So the qualitative themes, while they were rich and were able to tell us quite a bit, they may not have actually captured that full breadth of views within the sample. And in terms of future research, there were several directions I think would be particularly valuable in this area. And one is to explore how incorporating structural competency into training will affect counsellors' preparedness. Does teaching them about poverty and social detriments of mental health actually improve practice? The longitudinal or the comparative studies could really help answer something like this. And another direction that we could possibly focus more on is the qualitative research into intersectional experiences. Interviews or focus groups exploring how specific combinations of identities will shape the counsellor experiences. And thirdly, research into counsellors' own perspectives. How do trainees and practitioners understand LGBTQ plus competencies, and looking at what challenges they face and what support they would believe would help. And in terms of this, hopefully we can eventually make a training package that incorporates everything for everyone. So let's wrap this up. So this study found that LGBTQ plus individuals shared broadly consistent priorities for what they want from counsellors. Affirming counsellors, intersectional, trauma-informed practice that is grounded in genuine relational safety. Poverty and structural inequality are not separate from LGBTQ plus experiences. They are a part of it, and our training must reflect that. And LGBTQ plus competency appears to be understood increasingly as this foundational ethical minimum rather than a specialist domain. But that shift in perception must be matched by real structural change in how the training is designed and how it will be delivered. And ultimately, embedding LGBTQ plus perspectives and intersectional frameworks into counsellor education is simply not a matter of academic interest. It is a matter of professional accountability and some social justice. Counsellors should be equipped to meet every client with the knowledge, the skills, and the genuine presence that those deserve. This is what the research is asking for. Thank you so much for listening to my research.